Skeleton, bones and their names. There are 206 bones in the human body. Of the 206 bones, they can be broken up into two sections. The first section is the axial skeleton. The axial skeleton consists of 80 bones from the head, thorax, and trunk. This will include the skull, face, vertebral column, and the thorax. Cranium. The cranium consists of single sets and paired sets of bones. The single sets are the frontal, the sphenoid, and the occipital bones. The paired sets are the parietal and the temporal bones. Facial bones. Mandible, maxilla, zygomatic, hyoid bone. Vertebral column. The vertebral column consists of the cervical spine, atlas C1, axis C2, and cervical spine C3 through C7. The thoracic spine, T1 through T12, the lumbar spine, L1 through L5, the sacrum, S1 through S5, fused, the coccyx, CY1 through CY3, fused. Also note that the coccyx can be 3, 4, or even 5 fused bones. Thorax. The thorax consists of the sternum. The sternum is the manubrium, the sternal body, and the xiphoid process. To complete the thorax, you'll have the ribs. There are 7 true ribs, 3 false ribs, and 2 floating ribs. 12 pairs, equaling 24 total ribs. The second part of the human skeleton is the appendicular skeleton. The appendicular skeleton is separated into 2 parts, totaling 126 bones. The upper extremities contain 64 bones, and the lower extremities contain 62 bones. Upper extremities: scapula, clavicle, humerus, ulna, which is pinky side, radius, which is thumb side, carpals, there are 16, metacarpals, there are 10, phalanges, there are 28. Of the phalanges, you will need to remember the scaphoid, which is thumb side, and the pisiform, which is pinky side. Lower extremities: the innominate bones, which includes the ischium, the pubis, and the ilium. This is also known as the pelvic girdle. The femur, the tibia. This is the larger bone. It is the shin. It does connect to the knee, and it is the medial, smaller part of the ankle. The fibula, which is the smaller bone, not connected to the knee. It forms the bony outer ankle. Patella. Tarsals. There are 14. Of the tarsals, you should remember the calcaneus, which is the heel bone, and the talus, which makes up the lower part of the ankle, supporting most of the body's weight and distributing it through the feet. Metatarsals. There are 10. Phalanges. There are 28. Bone terms: diaphysis, shaft of the bone. Medullary canal, the center of the diaphysis, a hollow canal containing marrow. Epiphysis, End part of the long bone. Compact bone. Cortical bone. More dense material that creates much of the hard skeleton. Forms the cortex, or the hard outer shell of the bones. Cancellous bone. Trabecular bone, or spongy bone. Light, porous bone that resembles a honeycombed shape. Periosteum. Membrane that covers the surface of all bones. Endosteum. Lines the medullary cavity. Metaphysis. The neck of the long bone between the epiphysis and the diaphysis. Epiphyseal plate. Layer of hyaline cartilage where growth takes place in the long bone. Plate between the epiphysis and the metaphysis. Types of bones. Long bones, which would include the clavicle, the humerus, radius, ulna, metacarpals, femur, fibula, tibia, metatarsals, phalanges. Short bones. Carpals, tarsals. Flat bones. Frontal bone, parietal bone, occipital bone, temporal bone. Scapula, ribs, sternum. Irregular bones. Innominate bones. Ilium, ischium, pubis. Again, this is also known as the pelvic girdle. Vertebra. Sacrum, coccyx, mandible, facial bones. Sesamoid, patella. It helps to remember that sesamoid means sesame seed shaped. Further describing bones. Foramen, hole in a bone. Blood vessels, nerves, and ligaments pass through foramen. An example of this is foramen magnum. Fossa, a hollow or a depression. An example of this is the glenoid fossa of the scapula. Groove, ditch-like groove which contains a tendon or a blood vessel. An example of this is the bicipital groove of the humerus. Meatus, canal or tube-like opening in a bone. External auditory meatus is an example of this. Sinus, air-filled cavity within a bone. Frontal sinus cavity in the frontal bone is an example of this. Condyle, rounded knuckle-like projection. An example of this would be the medial condyle of the femur. Eminence, projecting prominent part of the bone. An example of this would be the intercondylar eminence of the tibia. Facet, flat or shallow articular surface. An example of this would be articular facets of a rib. Head, rounded articular projection beyond a narrow neckline portion of the bone. The femoral head would be an example of this. Crest, sharp ridge or border. An example, the iliac crest. Epicondyle. Prominence above a condyle or on top of a condyle. Example, the medial epicondyle of the humerus. Line. Less prominent ridge. An example of this would be the linea aspera of the femur. Spine. Long, thin projection. The spinous process. Or an example, the scapular spine. Tubercle. Small, rounded projection. An example of this would be the greater tubercle of the humerus. Tuberosity. Large, rounded projection. An example of this would be the ischial tuberosity. Trochanter. Very large prominence for muscle attachment. An example of this would be the greater trochanter of the femur. Process. A projection or outward growth. Example of this would be the olecranon process or the coracoid process